Thank you all for coming. Thank you Dr. Banerjee for the very kind introduction. Thank you HOD ma'am and all the faculty and professors here for extending your welcome to me. So my background is computer science. I have experience with engineering and numbers in general, and so we will go through what mathematics was there behind lockdowns and associated school and college closures, what evidence was there. This the date I left it as 24th March because 24th March marks the announcement of the 21-day lockdown 3 years back. Okay, so 3 years back the nation was in complete lockdown, as was the much of the rest of the world. So let us look at what scientific evidence, what mathematical evidence, what modeling evidence was there to usher in this, and whether that evidence has stood the test of time. I would like the talk to be interactive, so please feel free at any point of time to interrupt me. Some of the things I say, you may have a lot of questions, so feel free to stop me at any point of time to ask questions. Okay, so let me begin the talk with this story. An old man, a wise man, comes to a village and tells, I am coming from the neighboring village and there is a huge hailstorm coming your way, and this is the size of the hail which is falling. You all have to stay home to stay safe. And the people heed his warning, stay in their homes, and the hailstorm comes, and fortunately the people of the village are saved. We could have a similar story where the old man comes and tells that there is a tornado coming your way. You should not just stay home, you should actually go into the basement. And the people of the village followed his advice, and fortunately again not much life loss was there. Now these are some of the wise men and women who 3 years back and much longer after that also told us to stay home to stay safe from coronavirus. Many of these are politicians, many of these are scientists also. You may recognize many of the faces here. So we should ask the question, what happened without lockdown, without the forcible stay home, stay safe protocol? What happened? There was one prominent European country which refused to go with this advice of lockdown and stay home, stay safe. What was it? Sweden. So if you look at Sweden's numbers, Sweden of course had heavy COVID-19 casualties, and for this it was played in the media for having sacrificed its own population, killing all its elders. Not just in media, it was also vilified in scientific literature in many scientific circles. This did not happen just in 2020, even as recent as December 2022, there was an article in the print.in saying that there have been unnatural amount of deaths in Sweden because of they followed a very laissez-faire approach, they did not lock down. So I decided to look at the data, some simple numbers. This is openly available, you can do this in 15 minutes of 10 to 15 minutes of spreadsheet work from the link, Sweden's official health website, where they keep a lot of statistics. Sweden's data, like much of rest of Europe, is solid as best as can be. So, in this graph what I did is I took 3-month windows of time. So, there are 4 such windows in each year, and I took data of 6 years starting from 2015, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay. 2020 was when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. In fact, if you look at the numbers, April to June 2020, the 3-month window, April, May, June 2020 was the heaviest in terms of COVID casualties in Sweden. Okay. And you might have seen in media that this is a once in a century pandemic. So, the challenge is to spot the once in a century pandemic, which bar here corresponds to the heaviest COVID casualties. S. Okay. So, visually you can see that S seems to be the tallest. In fact, I put this question because S is not the correct answer. More than that, there are so many other bars which are pretty close. So, in other words, in the country which did not lock down, you not only cannot spot the pandemic correctly, it is similar amount of deaths have happened in the recent past, and of course, nobody made a huge call for stay home, save lives at that time. Okay. So, the answer is actually this bar I, this corresponds to 2015 if I remember right. If you go to the URL there or scan this QR code, you will get the answer also in addition to the question. Okay. So, this is Sweden which did not lock down. Okay. And one response which I get after showing this graph is, well, Sweden is among the best healthcare facilities in the world, which is true. Their healthcare is the absolute best in the world, and Sweden's population density is very low, much lower than most other places in the world. So, maybe that is the reason. So, next I take the in many ways the polar opposite of Sweden. In terms of population density, which is Dharavi. Dharavi is most of you will know, I think. It is a slum, largest slum in Asia. It is in Mumbai. If you land on flight, you will see Dharavi while landing or takeoff. And of course, except for the fact that it is in a major city, the healthcare facilities there is, I mean, people are extremely poor. Of course, it is in a big city, but other than that, there is not much healthcare to speak of. In that sense also, it is the polar opposite of Sweden. Okay. So, what do you think is the COVID-19 mortality rate in Dharavi compared to US? US of course is a developed country, again very low population density in most parts, and extremely good medical facilities. So, what is your guess? 1/3, okay. Any other guesses? So, that means you are saying Dharavi's death rate is lower than US, okay. Of course, the reason I put it is that it is lower. 20, 1/20th or 20? 20 times. Okay, your guess is 20 times. Okay. So, I encourage you to look at the numbers. These are the numbers which I have gathered from news sources. Mumbai is among the places in the country which is very good in terms of its statistics. Mumbai and Kerala are probably the best in the country in terms of various public health statistics. So, these numbers, I mean, it's as best as you can get in India. So, the estimated population in Dharavi in 2.5 square kilometers is about 250,000 to 0.8 million. So, the deaths per million comes out to around 425, the COVID deaths per million. On the other hand, US is at 3,300. So, the answer there is 1/8. UK is similar, 3,100. Okay. So, the reason I am pointing this out is that Dharavi lockdown will only increase interpersonal contact. At least when there is no lockdown, for good part of the day people go to work to different other places and so on. But if you have lockdown, all of the people are going to stay there, interpersonal contact is very high. There is no meaning to social distancing there, it is just mathematically impossible. Advisories are coming, stay 6 feet apart, it is just impossible. 10 foot by 10 foot room, a family of 4 or 5 lives, and houses very close to each other, shared bathroom and so on. It is mathematically impossible to have 6 foot distancing in that place. Okay. So, this is what happened in Dharavi. Of course, age should be an important factor, but the again this should question the narrative of stay home, stay safe for lockdown. So, let us look at India as a whole. This is a graph I plotted with numbers from our world in data. One of the lines shows the death, that is red is the death curve, and the blue one is the cases. They follow similar pattern. So, strict lockdown existed until 31st May. From June onwards, June 2020 onwards, was various stages of unlock, stage 1, stage 2, go on, so on until stage 5. For those of you who may remember, the peak was around September middle. Okay. Unlock has been going on since June and continued all the way until February, March 2021, increasing levels of in fact by October, November, everything was back to normal except colleges and schools. Okay. And of course, there is no place in India which is not crowded. Trains, buses, market, post office, bank, there is no place in India which is not crowded. And there were very prominent cases of large crowds. Buses for Mumbai, public buses opened on October. Election campaigns were going on with lots of crowded pictures. Farmers protests, again lots of crowd happened November to February 2021 in Delhi, New Year parties in Goa. But there is no prominent effect of human activity on the COVID curve. Lock versus unlock does not seem to matter. In fact, local trains for Mumbai opened in February 2021. February nothing happened, March nothing happened. April, May is when the second wave started. Okay. So, the point I want to make here is that lockdown versus unlock does not seem to have much correlation with what shape of the curve was followed by COVID. So, this is a study which looks at 188 countries, pretty much the entire world, and looks for correlation between stringency of the measures measured as per a metric to the COVID mortality. Okay. And what they concluded was that stringency of the measures including lockdown did not appear to be linked to death rate. So, the mathematical correlation was near 0. In fact, what they found was a positive correlation. Okay. So, if the messaging stay home, save lives were indeed correct, you would expect a huge death rate in countries which did not lock down versus much lower ones in countries which did lock down. That was not the case. the correlation was in fact the reverse, slight positive correlation was there. The more stringent the measures, the higher the COVID mortality. There was a slight positive correlation, 1.1 or so if I remember right. So this paper actually appeared in November 2020. Okay. So then you will have to ask how lockdowns came to be. The narrative which was being pushed was that it is a very novel situation, novel virus, nobody knew. However, it is not really a completely unexpected situation. Admitted that there is a novel virus which was causing deaths among a certain set of people. Nobody denies that. However, it is not that the situation was unforeseen. In fact, lots of countries as well as WHO had written guidelines, pages and pages of written guidelines of what to do in this exact situation. Okay. It is not like a completely unforeseen situation. They had huge documents, US CDC has, UK has, many countries, English speaking countries I have looked at, Australia has, probably many of the other European countries also have, I have not looked, WHO itself has, on what to do in case of a respiratory virus pandemic. So, I will highlight something from the WHO 2019 guidelines. This guidelines was written in 2019, okay, not very far back from when the pandemic actually happened. This particular table I will highlight as a screenshot taken from the guidelines. It has several rows, what to do in case of moderate pandemic, what to do in case of high severity, what to do in case of extraordinary severity. And the specific thing I want to highlight is the last row, which says not recommended under any circumstance. Okay. So, let us look at what is written there under not recommended under any circumstance. Contact tracing. What is the guideline which came out just yesterday, I believe, yesterday or day before? Contact tracing is not recommended under any circumstance, not even extraordinary. Okay. If you look at the numbers, probably COVID will fall under moderate or perhaps high in some settings. Contact tracing. After that, quarantine of exposed individuals. Okay. Suppose some household member of yours is down with COVID and you visit that person to take care, to just as a courtesy visit, whatever it is, you are exposed. It says you do not have to be quarantined. Quarantine of exposed individuals is not recommended under any circumstance. If you think about it, lockdown is basically quarantine of everybody, right. Here we have a situation where quarantine of exposed individuals is not recommended under any circumstance, but the entire world was doing lockdown. So, as gross a violation of this written guideline as possible. Entry and exit screening and border closure. So, many of these of course, UV light and modifying humidity did not quite happen, probably the technology did not exist, does not exist, but the last 4 here were certainly done throughout contact tracing. In fact, even now they are doing this kind of stuff. Okay. So, this is one thing I wanted to point. You want to remove this? Okay. The mouse pointer, is it? Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you. Okay, so likewise, we have a table from US CDC's guidelines. This was written in 2017. I have highlighted some parts here. So, here the columns represent different levels of severity, low to moderate, high, very high severity. What it says here, I will read this out. CDC might recommend voluntary home quarantine of exposed household members. Okay, voluntary. If you want, you do. On the other hand, what we had was throughout the world, state mandated stay at home orders. Okay. All right. So now we have to ask, how did this come to be? When there are written guidelines for handling this exact situation, why the entire guidelines were completely basically thrown into the waste basket and completely novel approaches taken. So the rest of the talk I have divided into 6 different parts. It was based on the following 6 aspects. First is the rejection of immunity after natural infection. The second is there was wild exaggeration, probably there still is wild exaggeration of the threat posed by the disease to different sections of the community. There was gross exaggeration of the role played by asymptomatic transmission. The PCR test was pushed as a viable diagnostic tool. Lockdown was being projected as the only viable solution and even the humane approach to address the problem. And finally, I will touch upon treatments which actually harmed more than helped. I am not of course a clinician, but I will just talk based on not my personal experience, but documented evidence. So, if you want to know the crux of the talk in just 2 minutes, this graph should show it. Lockdowns did work, and this is a graph of one place where it worked. So, as you can see, the y axis is the cumulative deaths, and kept rising, and lockdowns were imposed, then it became flat, 0. What place is this? China. So, this was the data which was given to the world to usher in lockdowns. Since then, no other country has been able to produce this graph, no other country. So, you will have to question either the data or something else. Okay, so let us get into the 6 parts now. So, first is rejection of immunity after natural infection. Chronologically, probably this is not the first which happened, but I have put this because in some sense scientifically this is the most egregious, most absurd in many ways, because immunity after natural infection is something, I mean I have studied until 12th class biology, I remember that. I know that even for my pet, you do not have to vaccinate if the dog has gone through the disease already. That is something, in fact that is the basis of traditional vaccines, right. So, if you reject immunity after natural infection, that should make you an anti-vaxxer. But this was being portrayed from the beginning. WHO had and still has this tagline of no one is safe until everyone is safe. Okay. So, this is a screenshot of a website, it says the modified date was 20th July 2021, but from the beginning this tagline was there. This is a UN video dating back from July 2020. What does it mean? If I have had an infection and I have recovered, I am safe. Why should I wait for my neighbor and the neighbor's son and daughter neighbors to get infected, or people in Africa to be safe? It does not make any sense. This tagline is scientifically, it does not make sense. It is a rejection of immunity after natural infection, and it is still there. Okay. It is not that WHO has corrected its mistake, no. This is one instance. The other is WHO changed the definition of the term herd immunity itself. There is a website called Wayback Machine where you can get different versions of a particular web page historically, okay. And this is a screenshot of the web page, WHO's web page as it existed on this pointer works, is it? Is there a pointer? No? Laser won't come, okay, it's okay. Okay, so this is from October 23, 2020. So where it says, I will read it out. Herd immunity happens either through vaccination or immunity developed by a previous infection. In 1 month, they changed it to say it counts only if you are vaccinated. So you are protected from a certain virus only if threshold vaccination is reached. So this again is rejection of immunity after natural infection. And our own PM's line, jab tak dawai nahi, tab tak dilai nahi, is also the same, rejection of immunity after natural infection, right. If I have already been infected, why do I care? I do not have to have delay, rather I can be carefree, I do not, it is like pre-pandemic days for whoever has been infected and recovered. Okay, so WHO then our Modi, he was also of course proudly following WHO's line. This is the Lancet in October middle 2020. There was a declaration by a group of scientists where again among other things they questioned immunity after natural infection. It is unclear how long protective immunity lasts. Well, of course, in science everything has an element of doubt. It is unclear whether an asteroid is going to strike next moment. You have to go by what is known science. Everything, although everything in science is of course questionable and should be questioned. This is Lancet in mid October 2020. This is Lancet editorial. The editor of Lancet has written end of January 2021 the case for no COVID, where again the basis of this is we simply do not know how long immunity lasts. And this same write up says the path to normality is via lockdown. Phase 1 is lockdown. Note that by this time all the data which I had shown earlier, that was all known, right. Sweden's data was known, Dharavi's data was known, and China's data was known. Still this was a statement made in end of January 2021 in Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious journals. And then scientists were calling for virus elimination, same as Lancet, no COVID, okay. So you want to reduce COVID to 0. Of course, by that time also it was known that there was community spread all over, lot of the people do not even show symptoms, and there were also non-human species which the virus had as host. So given this, the goal of virus elimination is not just impossible, it is close to delusional. You cannot eliminate respiratory virus which is already spread so far widely across the planet even to other species. And this is again highlighting data from where social distancing is impossible, that is Dharavi. So this many of the scientists, I should really comment here, scientists from TIFR worked with BMC. I should commend both the people who worked with the BMC as well as the BMC officials. BMC is the Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation. They were doing lot of sero surveys. Of course, they also did the lockdown, but thankfully they did this also. So at least we have the data to talk about it now. So what was found was that nearly two thirds of the people in slums were already they had antibodies, and again repeating the data from this is the table I have taken from my book. The details you can find. Basically, by my estimate, even if you assume that all of the COVID deaths which happened in Dharavi were over and above what would have happened, the excess death is about 7%, and that is much below what is there in most European countries, US and so on. Not only that, there was nothing happening there after this. This was in July 2020. By official numbers as well as by anecdotal accounts, I have talked to so many people coming from Islam community in the working class. There is nothing much has been going on in terms of COVID there since August 2020. No noticeable second wave either. Okay. So what this means, immunity after natural infection works, that is what it means. So this is all the first aspect of why lockdowns were ushered in, the rejection of immunity after natural infection. The second part is a gross exaggeration of the disease threat. So now I will do a disclaimer, I am not trying to minimize the threat which it did pose to a certain section of the population, nor am I trying to minimize the lives which were lost, that is not my intention, but I want to show through numbers the scale of exaggeration which was happening. So let me begin with what was happening in early 2020. Early 2020, thanks to this technology called social media, there were all sorts of videos going around in social media and quite a few of them in mainstream media also. This is an example of one such video. You might have seen this, where in China, a group of like 20 members of SWAT team with all vehicles and guns and whatnot, they catch a man trying to escape or whatever. One does not know what's exactly happening there. They catch him with a butterfly net and put him in quarantine. Now, if somebody looks at this video, it is really scary, right? Why would police SWAT team have to catch a person with a butterfly net and do this kind of thing? So, it sends a very scare message. There were other videos going around of people walking on the street just keeling over and falling, supposedly from coronavirus. Making the rounds in social media and quite a few in mainstream media also. Now we know after 2-3 years of COVID that people just suddenly falling over and dying like that does not happen, at least not from COVID. Okay. There may be other reasons why these are happening, we need not get into that, but from COVID nobody has experienced this kind of death where people just walking on the street fall over and die. So this was to illustrate the level of exaggeration which was going on. And then there was this image, Croatia had a horrible earthquake just before COVID pandemic, and there was an image from there which was morphed and claimed as though it was from Italy, where patients were waiting for hospital bed, COVID patients were waiting, and this image was making the rounds in Facebook and WhatsApp and so on. In fact, BBC called it out, many other media also called it out, saying that this is a fake image, it's not of patients from Italy, but it's an image from Croatian earthquake which happened slightly earlier. And then while social media was sending images from Croatia as though it were from Italy, mainstream media was sending images from Italy as though it were from New York and Pennsylvania. This is one such documented instance where CBS News, which is a big mainstream news in the US, in end of March 2020 took a video from Italy hospital and it claimed it was from New York. At that time there was a lot of panic in New York. In fact, this is one of the things which contributed to the panic. and they were caught on it, meaning somebody caught that, well, this is a footage from Italy, not from New York. Why are you portraying as though it is from New York? And then they claimed that it was an editing mistake, because of editing mistake it happened. After 1 week, they re-added the same footage as though it were from Pennsylvania. Now, whether an honest mistake can happen twice in a row within a week of one another, what motive you will attribute to this, that is left to you, but this is what happened. Okay, so this is the level of misinformation which was going around not just in social media but also in mainstream media. Now, what about WHO? So, WHO 1 week before declaring COVID as a pandemic, on 3rd March, the Director General Tedros, this is the exact quote of what he said. He claimed that the fatality rate of COVID is 3.4%, whereas the seasonal flu which we are used to kills far less than 1%. This was these exact quotes. From this link you can find. What happened once he gave this statement? The entire world media ran with it, and you can find instances of this in US media, all over US media, Europe media, Indian media, everywhere. They were saying this 3.4% as the fatality rate of COVID, whereas seasonal flu is only 0.1%. It looks very dangerous. Obviously, 30 times more dangerous than what we are used to is enough to scare anybody, right? There was only one problem with this. This comparison was false. This is a graph which I have taken from one of the mainstream media. You can still find it. Business Insider, a very wide reach popular mainstream media. So, in March, early March 2020, it had this graph showing the fatality rate of comparing the fatality rate side by side of flu and COVID. Well, this looks scary. If you look at it now, it is still scary, but it is false, because it was comparing the case fatality rate of COVID with the infection fatality rate of flu. I probably, to this audience, I do not need to tell what CFR IFR is. IFR basically has a much larger denominator. So, this was one of the main elements of the exaggeration of the threat and striking fear in people's minds. This is a summary graph which I have taken from my book. What are the numbers here? So, the blue ones are all IFR and the orange ones are the claimed mortality rate of COVID, 3.4% as originally claimed by WHO. Not to be outdone, Lancet came up with a paper in July 2020 where they said the mortality rate of COVID outside China could be as high as 15%. 15% is 1 in 6. That is enough to scare the hell out of anybody, right? And in fact, this 15% is literally off the charts here. This stops at 6%. Okay. However, what was known about the IFR of COVID even as early as April 2020, there was a Santa Clara study which estimated the IFR of COVID to be, well, it is certainly higher than what we are used to, but it is in the same range. It is not like 30 or 40 times higher, it is maybe twice. And there was also a dependent on age group. And there are many other numbers which also put in the same rough ballpark. In fact, for under 70 years old, the estimate was 0.05%. For under 50 years old, I did this analysis based on Mumbai's data. Under 50 years, it comes to 0.03%. The official IFR reported, population-wide IFR reported in UK Parliament in mid 2021 was in fact lesser than the IFR of seasonal flu. Okay. So, this link is also available, you can check it. So, this confusion between CFR and IFR was one of the major elements of exaggeration of the threat what was being posed, which in turn connects with why people accepted lockdown as a possibility of avoiding this. Another exaggeration was that a lot of media was comparing side by side COVID with Spanish flu. Of course, none of us here have lived through Spanish flu, but in the history of pandemics, it's a watershed moment, right? Such huge amount of lives lost within a short span of time that it's unthinkable the damage which happened at that time. We don't have to get into whether it was the virus or the lack of antibiotics or whatever, but the point is lots of lives were lost. And New York Times had a podcast where it compared the fatality rate of COVID with Spanish flu. Once again, this is a wild exaggeration. I have this graph in my book where I estimate the comparison between COVID-19 and Spanish flu based on available numbers. By my estimate, COVID was about 30 times less dangerous as per USA numbers. As per India's numbers, it's just off the scale. Some 800 times more deadly was the Spanish flu. There was huge amount of deaths in Spanish flu in India. Of course, the estimates themselves vary. There was no proper counting at that time. But still this kind of comparisons are happening not only in 2020 but also in 2021. New York Times again had an article in 2021. The Hindu had an article in 2021 comparing COVID with Spanish flu. But if you compare with the ground numbers being like this, then it's not just a normal exaggeration, it is like epic scale exaggeration. So once again, the exaggeration played a huge role in people's minds of why they accepted lockdown as a possible solution, when you don't think straight if you think there is so much danger coming at you. The third important part of ushering in lockdowns was the gross exaggeration of the role of asymptomatic transmission. People without any symptoms at all can transmit the virus to you. So this was a huge element in every person looking upon every other person as a disease agent, as not as a human. Right? The entire societal fabric was broken because of this. Was it based on evidence? The evidence for asymptomatic transmission from the beginning was very weak, very shaky. In fact, there was an early paper of case report of a lady from Germany who was said to have transmitted COVID, SARS-CoV-2 to many other fellow passengers in a flight. But that case report was later found to be wrong, in the sense that the lady did have symptoms at the time of traveling. And this was actually the flaw was reported in Science magazine. I think this link is Science magazine, Science Insider. And but by then the panic had already set in. Everybody was going around with the without having a skepticism of whether this is what's happening. People had somehow been scared to believe that every other person is a disease carrying agent. WHO in July 2020 had a report based on its investigations from China and suggested that people without symptoms could infect others. Okay, it did not have any scientific publications as reference, but its own report from February 2020. However, the strange thing was that when scientists tried to replicate this kind of studies in other countries outside of China, they could not replicate it. This was a paper from May 2020 from Taiwan. They did a contact tracing based assessment and they could not find any instance of asymptomatic transmission. There is this very interesting table you can find in this paper, the reference to which I have given here. November 2020 it appeared. It is a meta-analysis of various other studies which looked for asymptomatic transmission. So, it summarizes in this table 6 such studies. I am sorry for the font, but I will just read out the important part here. So, the first row shows secondary attack rate of 0%, meaning it did not find any instance of asymptomatic transmission. Second study 0%. Then the next 4 studies are very high numbers, 9%, 30%, 80% and 30%. However, there is a curious pattern you can see here. The first 2 papers are from researchers in South Korea. The next 4 are from researchers in China. Now, I do not have anything against Chinese or Chinese researchers, but one really has to question what sort of influence CCP had on those researchers when you are not able to reproduce those kind of results. I mean, these numbers are widely different, whereas 0% versus 80% and 30% and so on, right. And then there was this another meta-analysis which appeared in JAMA in mid December 2020, which basically concluded that asymptomatic transmission is statistically indistinguishable from 0. Okay. So, if you read the 95% confidence interval here, it says 0 to 4.9, but it should actually be minus 3.5 to 4.9, okay, because the midpoint is 0.7, which basically means it is statistically indistinguishable from 0. So, it was never based on hard evidence that people without symptoms at all transmit. And if you think back, this was one of the basis of the lockdowns, people without symptoms can transmit. UK government had a line where you act as if you got it, something like that. Right? Okay, so let us look at part 4, which is pushing the PCR test as a viable diagnostic tool. Of course, again this audience probably does not need any introduction to PCR test. PCR test itself has been around since a long time. However, its application for SARS-CoV-2 detection happened at the speed of science. So, let us look at what this speed of science is. I will draw your attention to the dates here. So, on the left side here is a screenshot from a report of a bunch of researchers with the WHO on January 17, 2020, and within 4 days this same material was submitted as a paper to Eurosurveillance Journal. And how many days does it take for you all to get a paper published? So, this was accepted within 1 day. So, this was the speed of science which happened for approval of PCR test for detecting SARS-CoV-2 using genome sequences from China. Lot of people complained about why this happened. They gave the reasoning that, well, it was an emergency and hence we had to fast track. Okay. Sounds reasonable, except that if you look back at the data, at the time of January, outside of China, I think the number of deaths were in probably single digits or maybe double digits. So, how can they conclude that an emergency was about to happen? Well, you make your judgment. Again, it is possible, of course, everything is possible, but when you take everything as a whole, it seems incredible. Now, what about the conflicts of interest which happened at the speed of science? The last author of the paper which I just showed, the paper based on which the notice came out yesterday to increase testing. The last author of that paper was an editor of the journal. Of course, again it can happen. It has happened to me also. Many journals have policy that editors can submit. They have a blinding process to whatever. I also have submitted. It can happen. There was also another conflict of interest. The second author had a company which manufactured testing kits. So, this Land is the second author of that paper. All of this is public information, you can verify, okay. Nothing is, all of this is verifiable in 2 clicks, and I have given all the references in my slides, okay. So, you have professional conflict of interest, you have financial conflicts of interest happening at the speed of science. Even if you admit that all of those happened in good faith and the science behind it is actually sound, but it is not sound. Again, if you look at the official documents, this is UK guidelines from January 2021, where they said that a person who has recovered from the virus after the body has fought off SARS-CoV-2, the viral fragments can remain in the body for up to 90 days. And the PCR test is only detecting viral fragments, it is not detecting live virus. The same thing was admitted much later by US CDC director in December 2021. So, it is not that the paper was based on sound science and what happened was indeed based on sound science, it does not seem to be. In fact, if you go around looking for respiratory viruses, especially in hospital settings among people who have died, you will find them. This is a paper which looked at respiratory viruses, detection of respiratory viruses using PCR test in people who are dead, paper from 2017 from Spain. It found that nearly half the people had respiratory virus, okay. However, prior to their death, only 7% were detected with the respiratory illness, which means that PCR positive does not mean that it is a cause of death. Of course, this does not need publications and references like this, it is common sense in many ways. Here we have a situation for the first time in human history where a person does not have any symptoms, there is no doctor in picture, but disease is detected. Is incredible. So, these are official numbers again from various news reports and official numbers. In our first wave, second wave, so called third wave, we had asymptomatic cases. What does it mean? Asymptomatic case means person is healthy. I mean, of course, people in the street had figured it out. If perfectly healthy, they are more afraid of getting forcible tests done. Why you want to get your entire building quarantined, right? Incredible numbers, 80%, 95%, 99% in Bangalore. This was the percentage of asymptomatic cases. Well, this is happening because I am sure you all know PCR test was designed as a research tool. It is not for virus detection in the absence of a doctor. It can be used as a diagnosis, in addition when a doctor recommends it for certain clinical treatment, it may be necessary. But you cannot have Arvind Kejriwal and Uddhav Thackeray using PCR tests to label people as diseased and shutting off entire cities. That does not make any sense at all. And WHO does not have any clinical diagnosis protocol to this day. It cannot have because the symptoms are all very overlapping with other conditions. So, till date, the test which has been extensively so much used, there is no false positive rate. Nobody knows the false positive rate for disease detection or infectiousness. There are some studies for presence of live virus, but these two are just impossible. There have been no studies because there is no clinical diagnosis protocol. So, the projection of PCR test as a viable diagnostic tool again played a huge role in ushering in lockdowns, because they can just ramp up tests and show people as positive. It is actually dead virus, the person is perfectly safe and healthy. So, let us come to the fifth part, where lockdowns were projected as the humane solution. So, WHO from the beginning has been praising CCP's methods for fighting coronavirus. This is a quotation from their 30th Jan 2020. Welcome the leadership and political commitment of Chinese government and their commitment to transparency. If I have to think of a government which is transparent, the last country I will think of is China, right. For decades it has been a government which is completely non-transparent, no journalistic freedom, no foreign journalists allowed, and then here we have WHO praising. How can a government suddenly turn transparent overnight? It is incredible. The same day, WHO Director General's statement congratulated for extraordinary measures taken to contain the outbreak despite severe social and economic impact, basically praising China's lockdowns, again praising that graph which I showed earlier. So, this WHO's praise for CCP's methods was of course going on for a long time, and then Canada's members of parliament called one such WHO official. This is a picture of Bruce Aylward. He was the one who is going around showing China data to many places in the world. They called him, they summoned him for an investigation. Okay, they issued a summons to him. This was in April 2020. He did not go, and as of August 2020 he had not testified, and WHO had forbade him from testifying. So, who is the boss? Are they the elected representatives of Canada or WHO? WHO was praising CCP's transparency while doing this, being non-transparent itself. And then we have the modelers. This was Neil Ferguson group from Imperial College London, one of the most reputed colleges in the world, basically lending implicit credence to this graph, saying that this graph resulted because of China's measures to control COVID-19. Okay, this was the thing which was used to usher in lockdowns in UK. What about Nature, one of the most prestigious publication venues? Researchers are trying to study the effects of China's lockdowns to see how they have controlled viral pandemic. Once again, as a reminder, this was the graph which they were lending credence to, a graph which no other country has been able to reproduce. Now, far from being transparent, CCP was known for its manipulative methods. New York Times, in one of its rare moments of actual journalism, had a series of articles calling out China's social media campaign. They had lots of bots, fake accounts, using which they were flooding the internet, flooding social media, flooding Twitter with praise for CCP's methods of handling COVID pandemic. So, basically what is going on is information warfare, right. You do not need to have warfare with guns and tanks or bombs. Information warfare is what is going on. While China was doing this kind of information manipulation, US was not far behind in terms of its own censorship. In early October 2020, you may know that 3 epidemiologists came out with the Great Barrington Declaration as a position statement against lockdowns, saying it's not going to do anything to the disease, you need to do focused protection, focus on those who are actually vulnerable, and otherwise you are going to have a lot of collateral damage. Fauci and Collins, who were at high places in National Institute of Health, which is sitting on lots of funding money, at that time collaborated with social media companies to censor the Great Barrington Declaration. Okay. So, the exact wording is there needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. This was revealed in an email from a equivalent of our RTI. They have a US has a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, that is the equivalent of our RTI. So, this is from an email which Collins wrote to I do not remember exactly to who, but he was calling for social media to companies to take down Great Barrington Declaration. So, it looked as though there was scientific consensus that lockdowns were the only viable solution, but censorship is easy, consensus is easily shown when you have censorship. If you take down all the voices which are speaking out against, then it looks like it is a consensus, but it is not really a consensus. So, this is part 6. What happened because of the panic? There were lots of instances, documented instances now of treatments which we now know causing more harm than helping. Early on, WHO was recommending early mechanical ventilation, again based on studies from China. And then later on, after the huge number of deaths which happened in New York, there were papers calling out that this is not the right way to do it. The early intubation paradigm was wrong, clinically wrong. And in fact, there was an incredible article in the Wall Street Journal in December 2020. I will read this out because it's heart wrenching in many ways. One of the doctors, doctor or nurse, doctor says, we were intubating sick patients very early, not for the patient's benefit, but in order to control the epidemic and to save other patients. That felt awful. Well, it ought to feel awful, isn't it? So, this was the containment narrative that was pushed. Who knows how many people fell prey because of this kind of wrong intervention, which was done not for the benefit of the patient, but for so called containment. And then we all know about the panic which happened in 2021 during India's second wave. There is a journalistic piece by Priyanka Pulla in the Mint which reported on a certain batch of remdesivir from Zydus Cadila, which was later found to be very toxic. So, basically the drug which was people were craving for, it was selling in the black for lakhs of rupees. It turned out that who knows how many came from this bad batch and basically killed people, right. So, we really do not know how many were actually killed by the virus versus how much by the panic, this kind of bad medication and so on. And remdesivir itself, it was being questioned in some publications at least as whether there is any benefit at all for its use in COVID. This is a publication which appeared in 2022, randomized control trial, which said that there was no clinical benefit observed. So, here we had a situation where people were spending their life's earnings to get a drug, whether it was from the bad batch or good batch, we do not know, but statistically there does not seem to have been any benefit. And what about the lockdown as a measure itself? In I do not know exactly when, sometime in 2020 or 2021 I believe, US CDC came up with this list of comorbidities of COVID, and probably many of you here know this already, but this is the exact list from the CDC study. At the top is obesity, that is the topmost comorbidity. Second is anxiety, fear, and third is diabetes. Now, what happened because of lockdown? Obesity increased, at least among people who were able to afford food, obesity increased. In countries which measure, this is documented. Australia, I believe the average weight increase was like 3 kilos or something. If the average was 3, then good number of people would have increased much more than that. Anxiety, of course, every 24/7 into 365 into 2 years, scare, right. Any time you open the news, it's anxiety and fear. On the other hand, if it's a real panic situation, you will have to calm people down to reduce the mental toll as well as the actual toll of deaths. People were denied walking, exercise, gyms closed, playgrounds closed, no morning walks also. What happens to people with diabetes? And then this is another big one, vitamin D deficiency. So, if you shut down an entire population for an entire year saying stay home, stay safe, you would expect that vitamin D levels will go down because sunlight is important for vitamin D, and this Israeli study documented an increase in risk of 14 times for COVID severity because of vitamin D deficiency. So, lockdown itself, far from being a solution, was in fact counterproductive in many ways among the top comorbidities, and empirically we have our second wave to tell that tale, right. It did not save lives, it just postponed perhaps and then probably increased the toll much more. So, here is a summary of the lockdown house of cards and the mechanism used to prop up the house of cards: rejection of immunity after natural infection, exaggeration of disease threat, notwithstanding the fact that the disease did pose a threat to certain section of the population, gross exaggeration of the role of asymptomatic transmission, use of PCR test without any clinical diagnosis or doctor as a viable diagnostic tool, projecting lockdown as a only solution, and pushing treatments which we now know harmed more than helped. And this was all created by a whole host of mechanisms: media blitzes, social media blitzes. Social media, of course, there is no control. Lot of instances of poor quality scientific publications like the PCR test, like the asymptomatic transmission study, some with obvious conflicts of interest, and then censorship of people, scientists who talk against the message. So-called health agencies with financial conflicts of interest are just giving false messaging. I mean, starting with WHO, no one is safe until everyone is safe. That tagline should be removed immediately and relegated to a museum. And last but not least, incredible trust without actual proper scrutiny. It's not that you shouldn't look at Chinese data or papers from China or anything, but there should be skepticism. There should be skepticism of any data, especially from a source which is traditionally non-transparent. There should be even more skepticism, but there was no such skepticism. Why the world believed in such an incredible data, historians have to answer. So, I will come back with a different story now. Suppose an old man comes to a village near a volcano and says, look, the volcano has erupted, stay home to stay safe. That does not make any sense. Worse, if he comes to a coastal town and says, look, a tsunami is coming, stay home to stay safe, you should label him as a madman. If you stay home, you are only going to get drowned. If a tsunami is really coming, you should run. So you have to ask the question, did lockdown save lives, whether it was an instance of staying home to protect yourself from hailstorm or staying home to supposedly protect yourself from a tsunami. I think hopefully the data that I have given throws light on which one of the two it is. I will leave it to you to conclude. I would like to acknowledge this extraordinary book written by Michael Sanger, Snake Oil, How Xi Jinping Shut Down the World. You see the graph here. A lot of the data is my own also, my own as in from my research, references to which you will find in my book, but good number of references I have also taken from his book. I would like to acknowledge. Thank you.